Welcome. It's 9 o'clock here in California. And as folks roll in from all over the world, I want to offer a warm welcome and happy Earth Day. Today on Earth Day, we want to address this major pressure point between space enthusiasts and Earth environmentalists. So there's a very real poly crisis happening right now on the planet, and the undercurrent of that is, rapid climate change, and it's a very complex topic. At the same time as Earth is engaging in all of these crises, we are reaching out into space in a new way. There's this acceleration of exploration and participation from the commercial sector as well as different nations, and many have their eyes set on the moon, right? So as we have these plans to go to the moon to stay, there's a strong critique from Earth environmentalists about using these resources that we have and using industry to continue to pollute when we really should be focusing on the crises here on Earth. However, space environmentalists, folks who are focused on space enthusiasts, most of them say we're going to space for Earth. Everything that we're doing in space helps the Earth. And it's going to benefit humanity and the Earth. And so we want to address this really, really clearly and specifically in regards to the lunar plans. So how do we reconcile these? We're going to be breaking things down into their fundamental definitions, and we have two incredible panels here today with experts from many disciplines and from all over the world. So hello, I'm Christina Starr. I'm your moderator and your host today. So I'm going to be your guide through this entire event, which again has two panels and two discussion breaks. I have a background in physics and climate change and mass extinctions, as well as space policy. And I'm a lifelong environmentalist. And what I do for most of my time is train space and science technology professionals, emotional intelligence, and leadership skills that are aimed towards being able to be aligned for the greater good, for benefit. So that's my lens and my perspective. I'm always looking for systems holistically, interdisciplinary, and for each individual to be able to find their own path to being of benefit. All right, so without anything further, we're going to jump into our first portion of the program. And to introduce the first panel, I have Giuseppe Ribaldi, who's a senior space policy advisor. He's the president of the Moon Village Association and the executive secretary of the Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities.
Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And of course, let me first thank you, Christina, and the team of Cosmic Citizen Training, as well as my colleagues of the Moon Village Association and the Human Space Program to make this meeting possible. I would like to introduce briefly the Moon Village Association. MVA is a unique NGO created in 2017 to foster global peaceful lunar cooperation and coordination by bringing together stakeholders from space agency, government, international organization, NGO, academia, as well as the public. Members are coming from more than 60 countries, representing a diverse array of technical, scientific, cultural, interdisciplinary fields. MVA is conducting activities not covered by other organizations in areas such as lunar governance, engineering, capacity building, education, and much more. More detail can be found on our website. MVA, furthermore, is a permanent observer to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. This meeting, co-organized with all other two organizations, is a typical example of dealing with new topics. Today's Earth Day is therefore the good time to initiate in a structured way a dialogue between Earth and lunar environmentalists. This is unique. I do hope that this will be the start of a new way to look at the Earth and the Moon, not as two separate entities, but interconnected to benefit humanity. In a similar way, like the picture of the Earth seen from the Apollo astronaut on the way to the Moon has created a new sense of fragility of the Earth seen from space and the start of the environmental movement. As the Apollo astronaut Bill Anders said, we came all this way to explore the Moon, and the most important thing is that we discover Earth. The lunar exploration utilization is happening now, with several missions each year, and the goal to bring back humans to the Moon by the end of these decades. However, in order to continue in a sustainable way, it is urgent to start assessing its feature and the connection with the most challenging threat to Earth, that is climate change. I take this opportunity to inform you that the World Space Week theme for this year is space and climate change. And this is a demonstration of the importance that space world is giving to the Earth environment. The first panel, which is about to start, is called The Environment in the New Space Age. This will start indeed to assess the interconnectivity of Earth and the Moon and their associated environments. Furthermore, the effect of lunar exploration and utilization with forward and backwards impacts on Earth needs to be understood in order to ensure that this activity will bring clear benefits to humanity. Without further delay, I return the floor to Cristina so we might begin panel 1. Enjoy this groundbreaking discussion.
Thank you, Giuseppe. All right, so we are going to bring our panelists up here. And as we do, I'm going to introduce this topic. So before we can really talk about the climate change and the Earth's environment and lunar exploration and how these things are related, we need to define our terms, essentially. So it's maybe not as easy as you might think to define the Earth and the environment. So this is where we want to get really clear on, like, what is the Earth environment? And for this, we're trying to dial in on this more precise definition of the Earth's environment, the Moon, the nature of their relationship, environmental protections, and implications for lunar exploration and utilization. So let me introduce this panel. We have a number of specialists here to add to this. And first, we have Dr. Alice Gorman. Alice Gorman is a space archaeologist who is a professor and an author. She has a specialty really in understanding the impact that space has had on culture, and then the impact our culture has had on space, quite groundedly. Dr. Jean-Claude Worms is from COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research, and this is an organization that has been around since 1958 and has played a key role in UN and space policy and space research in that whole time. His background and specialty is he's an astrophysicist by training who's had a lifetime of science management and international collaboration on science projects. Dr. Martin Elvis is an astrophysics professor at Harvard and Smithsonian, and he's got a passion for asteroid and lunar resources, and as well as observational astronomy from the moon. And finally, we have Alvin D. Harvey here, who is finishing up his PhD at MIT in aeronautics and astronautics, and specifically focused on indigenous methodology and methods in research in aeronautics and astronautics. So thank you, everyone. And we're going to jump right in. I want to address this first question, which is, what is the Earth environment? What does it need to include for us to actually consider it the Earth? And I want to kick this off with Jean-Claude with his.
Well, guess what? I'm not an environmental scientist. Hello, everyone. I'm not a lawyer either. And so I will certainly not attempt to define the environment. Like life, it's one of these things that the definition is taken for granted, but very hard to actually define. Your question originally related to Earth and Moon. So in that sense, I like to think of this coupled system. And certainly from an astronomical, celestial mechanics, even evolutionary perspective down on Earth, the Moon and the Earth are coupled. This has created a sort of interdependence, a long-lasting tug of war and peace, where, for instance, the pull from the Moon resulted in slowing down the length of the day, less spin energy from the Earth, sending the Moon into higher orbit, the distance between the two increasing, etc. So it has obvious impact on us and on Earth and on the environment. It's likely, for instance, that the impact of the mass-size object that created the Moon has tilted the Earth's original axis to 23, 24 degrees from the ecliptic, creating seasons, and we live with that. And not just that, but the Moon's presence actually helps keeping this tilt relatively, essentially stable over time. And so we have the tides, that are also something that we live with, and a lot of people are talking about the moonlight. I'm sure Alice has encountered these issues as well. The lunar light, of course, is not its own light; it comes from the sun. So there's no demonstrated correlation between the lunatics and the lunar light, but the added nighttime light seems to increase, for instance, predator success in hunting. So this is all part of our evolutionary ensemble. And that's not even mentioning the cultural value of the Moon for all humankind. So yes, they're coupled. If we talk about we've been talking about the Earth's environment for some time. We've even started to create laws for the environment. So it's probably time to think about extending this reach to the Moon.
Yeah, thank you. I want to follow up with Martin here and see, because Jean-Claude did a great job of kind of outlining some of the physical science that compels us to take the Moon and Earth as a single system. Can you add and expand on anything that he shared?
Well, Jean-Claude got through all the points pretty much I wrote down.
Sorry.
Well, there you go. On the other hand, I rather think these things like the tides and so on, they're very long term, and they're not something we can influence. They're just there. So I don't think there's any big change there. To a very large extent, you could actually take the Earth and the Moon as separate, isolated environments. And there isn't a lot of movement backwards and forwards yet. But when we go there at scale, that will change. And that's what I want to be prepared for.
That's an interesting follow-up there, as you say, not to get too far ahead of things, but you say we go there at scale, it could change. What factors can actually change? That's where we're dialing in on the physical influence.
It depends on what I meant by at scale. I'm thinking of large human or even decent sized human bases on the Moon, which would be involved in water mining, and in particular at the South Pole. People are very keen on that. And once you're doing that, you're disturbing gigayears, billions of years of deposition of that material. and we don't really know what it's made of. It probably contains a great deal of history of the solar system and even of the passage of the solar system through different clouds in space over that time. And also these places where you're doing the mining, something close to my heart is that there can be very good sites for wonderful new telescopes that could teach us an enormous amount about our place in the universe. But if we disturb them too much, they won't be any use for that. So we're keen to protect that.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, people will be inevitably leaving garbage behind. When I say inevitably, if we don't think carefully about how we do things. So I worry about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you touched on a lot of good points there, and we'll end up revisiting some of these throughout this discussion today. Just to be clear, though, trying to identify the Earth and Moon as a system, you know, there's what I heard you say, Martin, is that they're like, physically speaking, we can't really worry too much about cross influence, about what we do on the moon really influencing Earth.
Not directly, not physically, no. But of course, physics is only part of the situation.
And I wonder
politics is another.
Yes.
If I can ask Alice, right? Because you have this understanding of the impact that we have had on space, especially when we enter into the environment of, say, the orbital environment with this idea of the frontier, and that we can't really make an impact on it because it's such a big, vast, new place. So I'm curious from what your perspective is on, Elvis sharing that we can't really make an impact on this system at large scale.
Well, I have a few thoughts about this, I guess. Well, I suppose before I say anything further, though, I will follow the Australian tradition and acknowledge that I'm talking to you today from the lands of the Wiradjuri people of New South Wales, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to any traditional owners in our international audience today. So thinking about this question, I want to come back to something you said in the beginning, which is how we might redefine Earth in order to understand its environment more fully, because there are so many cultural factors which are involved in what we call environment, and indeed how we define the Earth and the Moon. And relating to what Martin said, traditionally, we've seen the Earth as having an environment which is composed of living ecologies, and that the moon does not have those things. And there's a very strong cultural belief that the moon is therefore a dead world. And this then leads to the idea that it's not possible to have impacts on it. It's already dead, so we can't kill it. And I think this is what's so critical about looking at these two celestial bodies as part of the same system. And I think one thing that would have an effect on terrestrial ecologies is massive changes in albedo. And I think Martin's right. That's not something that's going to happen from a few little missions to the surface and a few small scale industrial activities. But there's so much we don't know about the moon. And I think one of the things we don't know is what the nature of the impacts we have will be and how that could. We don't know what the borderline between at what point do things tip over into having an impact on the terrestrial environment. And the other aspect of this, I think, is, so we tend to focus and center Earth and center those living ecologies in what we think is important. So then we think, okay, shall we enlarge this to let the moon in? But we could equally say, well, it's not just about us letting the moon in. maybe we should be looking at the Earth as the sort of biotic component of the moon's environment instead of the other way around. So I think if we think about how we approach definitions of Earth and moon and environment, from how they're defined culturally, by which I mean scientifically as well, because those two things aren't separate, maybe there's a lot we can do by saying, well, let's draw those lines in other places and see what actions those lead to. So I hope that addresses some of the things that you were alluding to in your question.
Yeah, go ahead, Jean-Claude.
Both Alice, I mean, Alice just made the point that the moon is probably already dead, so we can't kill it. That's probably true. I mean, everything that we know about the moon tends to point in that direction. But we could do something. We could kill the science before we even have the opportunity to carry out science at a large scale on the moon. And this is where we need to be a bit careful on how we do things. I'm not saying we should continue to have, you know, the scientists as guardians of the galaxy that can go anywhere and do what they want. That's not the time anymore for this, but we need to be careful on how we run operations so that we can preserve the science for future generations.
But Jean-Claude, I just want to say, I don't think the moon is dead. I think we can kill the moon. But your point, your point is very well made all the same.
Thank you.
Right. Yes. That what I heard Alice say is that is a perspective that is out there, right? That is actually, you know, potentially part of the dominant paradigm that is carrying us in the direction of like moon settlement. And I really want to hear, Alvin, have you weigh in on this, especially from the perspective of coming from Indigenous science, and what the traditions that you're familiar with share for their understanding of the Earth and the moon and that relationship.
Stop, I'd like to say, Yate Shikis, She Alvin RV Unishia, Obajna Ajanishla, Hananahi Bashichin, Bligana Dashiche Ado, Kia An and Dashinele, Got Ego de Nahasnin Nishla. So in that way, I introduce myself in my people's way from the Navajo Nation. We call ourselves the Ne. And what we say is essentially introducing who we are and then also our 4 clans. And the reason we do that is so that we can always find our relatives, because you never know who you'll be related to. And in many ways, we're all related. And I want to give a lot of appreciation to Christina and her team and everyone for allowing us to have this conversation here. And I also have to express my gratitude to the Massachusetts tribe of Punkapog, as well as the Wampanoag Nations, where I'm at right now, where MIT is located. Again, I appreciate the question. I think, you know, one of the things that, and I don't speak for all Indigenous people, first off, I gotta preface this, what I'm about to say. I can speak to some of the interests that I've been able to understand and find as an Indigenous person doing research at MIT in this. But one of the things that, you know, is always a hinging argument, I think, and you've seen a lot of controversy with this over the past couple months, is, you know, is the moon alive? And if it isn't, or if it is, who owns it and who has a right to be able to dictate, you know, any type of interaction with that space ecology? And from an Indigenous paradigm, from a shared worldview, I'm really echoing what Dr. Gorman is saying, is like, it is a part of our environment, a part of our ecology here on Earth. And it is a living being in the sense that it is related to us and it has impacted our cultural and social identity collectively as humanity for eons, as well as other relations and other animals and other beings as well. So it is part of our living environment in that sense. And when we say that the moon is our grandmother, that it is a relative, I mean, what that changes really is not just our cultural worldview, but the way in which we do science. And from an Indigenous paradigm, as I understand it, is we're looking for ways to live in good harmony and good relationship with the universe and world around us, which is a dynamic process in itself. So it does change. And we have these core understandings, these tenets that a lot of people call mysticism, but is really carrying a lot of ethical and temporal data carried on through these sophisticated metaphors that inform the ways in which we can live a good life in harmony, in relationship with these other living beings, which also include mountains, to the creepy crawlies, the bugs, and including the moon as well. So when we relate to our environment in that way, I mean, think of it this way, is if I give you a rock and I tell you to exploit it, extract as much like minerals or anything from that, versus if I give you a rock and I say, live with this rock and relate to it like it's your relative. I mean, how does that change the way in which you try to seek that understanding of your place in the universe and the relationship really between that? And there are different ways to kind of shape the understanding of what is life when it comes to relating to space ecologies. I think one way to think about it too is, life is really about the relationship between two things, the kinship that you have with it as well, from an indigenous paradigm. And, again, I think going back to that idea that I agree with Jean-Claude that, the actions and things that we do, especially the words and how we define that relationship, particularly with the moon, will actually shape the way in which we do the science. So things like frontier and, manifest destiny, colonization, I mean, those are things that I think a lot of people are becoming aware of, based on our growing understanding of a history of the, I guess you can call it the old frontier, of things that, people, I mean, honestly, like one generation removed from my generation that I've experienced that kind of frontierism. And a lot of people still do experience that frontierism today and the type of damage that it does to our environment and to our bodies. So how we change that, how we change the language and the way that we relate to the moon, to these space ecologies, will influence the way in which we do science. And it'll actually help us keep the relevance of it, which I think is one of the challenges with, space technology and space exploration, is how you communicate the relevance of it and how you keep the social license to operate too. Because there's always going to be a cultural, social, political dimension to it that is going to allow us to continue to do this type of science and allow us to continue to understand how we relate and how we continue to do that in a good way going into the future. So kind of a short answer to what could potentially be a longer answer, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Oh, thank you. That's exactly what we're looking for, is to try to encapsulate as many different views from humanity as we can about, the science of like, what is the moon and the earth? How are they related? And to me, there is always an implicit ethical element in that. It's your perspective of what's important, what your goal is, what's important, what the mission is at stake, right? And so with that, we're not going to debate whether or not to go to the moon because it's happening. So I want to examine, like, with the current lunar plans in place, why are we going to the moon? This is a huge thing. When I talk to people about going back to the moon, a lot of people are like, why are we doing that? So what is the actual value that we are seeking? What are the motivations that are bringing us there? And I would love to ask Martin this first, as far as the motivation for returning to the moon.
Okay. I think when we say value, most people think of a commercial value, and there's also geopolitical value. And those are the two things that are actually taking us back to the moon right now, I think. Some people sense that they can make a lot of money out of exploiting it in some sense. Others think that we can't let the other guys be the first there and control the high ground and that kind of stuff. And that's all true. And any other kind of value of the moon and space kind of is irrelevant in one way, in that unless the commercial / geopolitical forces were there, we wouldn't be going anywhere, right? So they're paying for it. So at some level, we're dependent on that meaning of value. But of course, there are other values, and I already said I kind of emphasize the hidden knowledge that we're only beginning to appreciate, the possibilities for understanding the universe and how we came to be part of it, that we can get from uniquely, in some cases, from the moon, locations on the moon, for example. And then there's a big question about movement about, do rocks have rights, which is kind of a dismissive way of saying that no, they don't. But there is surely some value in the very alienness of the moon and other worlds. I mean, that strangeness gives them value, at least to me. And we don't want to lose that.
Thank you. Alice, I wonder if you could follow up on that. The same thing, like what do you see as driving the values of going to the moon?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much right. Like, there was more than 50 years between the Apollo emissions and where we are right now. And we've had large gaps where, there's just been the odd orbiter or some small mission. And we're in this new world now where everybody wants to go to the moon. And what's changed? And I think it's all of those geopolitical reasons, which means there's value to be seen in demonstrating technological competence, which then has a flow-on effect to national prestige, all of that kind of stuff. So it is pretty similar to the whole Cold War environment. So I think we really need to be, if this is inevitable, which people seem to think it is, then we need to be making sure we piggyback our science onto this, because the real value here, I think, is the scientific value. It's knowing what the moon can tell us that we can't learn on Earth, because we have atmospheres and plants and running water. It's all of those things encoded in the lunar environment, on the lunar surface and subsurface, which will tell us what was happening, from 4.5 billion years ago. And things like the predicted, that's not the right word, but the late heavy bombardment period of solar system history, which we know primarily from returned lunar samples. It's hypothetical. We don't even know what the geological history of the moon is, and of course that relates so much to our own geological history. So we need to know that stuff. So I think with all of the geopolitical stuff that's going on, it's important for science to have that strong voice to make sure that we do get that information potentially before the places where we might take samples from are contaminated by dust from another part of the moon or terrestrial stuff, all of that. So those scientific motivations are, of course, all there, but the balance is the thing I think we really need to be keeping our eye on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a panel that is, everyone here is scientifically trained. There's a particular bias in that, right? And so there's the desire to champion what can be learned, right? And making sure that we proceed in a way that we do not inhibit ourselves from learning as much as possible. But Martin, you also have your finger on the pulse of industry, and you mentioned that there's a lot of money to be made up there. Can you expand on that, and just what's the value commercially? Where is the money? What's possible? What are people thinking they can cash in on with the moon?
Sure. There's evidence for what you might think of as a large amount of water hidden in the pits of eternal darkness, or permanently shadowed regions, as you more professionally call them, at the polar regions. These are places that have never seen sunlight in the past 4 billion years. And so they've accumulated a lot of material from asteroid and comet collisions with the moon that and that material didn't boil off into space the way it would in a warmer place. It just stayed there. So there's up to about 1 billion tons of water in the poles. And some people would like to mine that for sustaining human bases. And that would not be really, that could be done commercially by having a commercial company sell that water to the people at the base, which would presumably be a government organization. So that's the main thing people are talking about. Oh, and you can also break the water down with sunlight into hydrogen and oxygen and make rocket fuel out of it. So you could then have an export industry of rocket fuel to an orbit in cislunar space, which would be easier to launch to than from the Earth, because of the gravity is so much weaker on the moon. Mm-hmm. There's also, of course, a lot of talk about helium-3, which in principle could be used to power our fusion reactors. It wouldn't even be the first generation of fusion reactors because it's a higher temperature reaction you need. That seems fanciful at the moment. It's a long way off because we don't have any working fusion reactors. But it turns out helium-3 is actually also very valuable for quantum computing by getting to lower temperatures and sustaining the coherence of the entangled state longer. You can get much more done in quantum computing that way. And so there could be, and it's very expensive. People are buying this from at enormous cost. So I don't know the number, but it's in the sort of millions per kilogram kind of thing, I believe. So there are startups trying to look at that, and the moon is a particularly good place to find helium-3. So, and it's spread in a bunch of locations all across the moon. There are some particularly concentrated spots, and those need to be defined, and then we have to see if there's conflicting interests. There might be in the case of one of them, which is in Mare Moscoviense, which turns out to be probably the best place to put a far-side radio telescope. But we can get into that later. So those are the things I know about that are definitely considered value commercially.
Great. Yeah. So there's water, I think a lot of Earth environmentalists would be like, we got plenty of water on Earth. Why would you go to the moon for water? But the main thing is that the water on the moon is to sustain utilizing resources that are there to sustain a lunar presence, to be able to be there. So, and then the other element of helium-3 is essentially to support and resource more technology revolutions here on Earth.
Yes, that would be on Earth. Yeah, the rest of water you only use in space. You don't, no point in bringing it back to Earth. There's a billion, excuse me, get it right, a billion tons of water, roughly. And that sounds like a lot, but it's only a fairly small lake. So it might be that we have to worry about how rapidly we consume that, depending on how it goes.
Right.
Of course, you might want to know if we should consume it.
Mm-hmm. Alvin, I'm curious for you, even personally, as someone who's interested in astronautics, what do you see as the value of returning to the moon?
That's an excellent question. I work with a lot of aerospace engineers, systems thinkers. I mean, a lot of amazing people here at MIT, and it really has become like a centering community that we have so many people coming to get their education and expertise and to really learn how to communicate the value of it too. And I've been a part of a lot of different courses that are engineering based, but are focused on how do you communicate the value of this particular CubeSat, of this particular lunar mining operation. And I think the challenges to the value of it, the space community, aeronautics and astronautics, has to be welcoming to that in a lot of ways. And I think, it's just because of the emotional and social and cultural component to space, is that our particular perspectives of it, whether it be individual or community-based or cultural-based, are like deeply seated within us. And sometimes when we get those challenges, from other people about the particular value of a particular perspective, particularly when it comes to doing science or doing mining or doing any sort of operations there, it's a real sticking point. I find that. And I think for me, in order to really enrich, enhance, and shape the value of this, to be able to communicate it and to actually ensure it has value too, it has relevance, is that we have to welcome in those individuals that are asking those questions. Like, well, what does this have to do with, a community that, suffering from all this type of uranium mining or, mining from all these precious minerals and things like that, when we're making like $1 a day. Like, we have to understand those particular different stakeholders, their challenges, their needs, their requirements, and to really expand our systems thinking when it comes to not just communicating the value, but defining it too. Because if we're really going to aspire to this humanist approach, this more worldly approach about saying this is going to be something that benefits everybody, then it actually has to have those stakeholders that are representative, at least beginning to represent a good majority of people and bringing with them their challenges and their expertise. And we can't excuse someone that, doesn't know about it or just says like, well, I don't know about that at all, as someone that doesn't have lived experience to be able to communicate, how does this relate to me, or how do we make this relevant? So I think about that in terms of communicating the value is, who is it valuable to? And I think we have to expand that notion and understanding too, especially to include in Indigenous communities and communities that have also been minoritized and excluded from these types of conversations. So again, I appreciate you, Christina, for welcoming me in, and as well as my brother, Justin, as well. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. But this is definitely a conversation that can go on for quite some time, and including in many different people. But, I am hopeful that there can be like a central value, a central perspective that we can all agree on that will enable us to reach an understanding about how to do science, about how to reach an understanding of the moon or other space ecologies as well. So that just requires a lot of conversation and a lot of sitting down and what we call peacemaking as well. But, I am hopeful for that too.
Yeah, thank you. And that's very much why we're here, is beginning a conversation that's much larger and longer and towards the goal of, ironing out some of the sticking points. And what you mentioned there is, maybe indirectly the kind of indirect effects that people like downstream from the industry could potentially receive. So there's the benefits. Now we've gone over like the benefits and the value of going to the moon. What are some indirect effects of like industry emissions, economic impact, positive or negative, of technology and the resources required, pollution of the industry, as well as, even expanding into just touching back to where we were talking before about the how actions on the moon itself could potentially have an impact on Earth. And so I want to check in first with Jean-Claude, see, with your finger on the pulse of international and global mechanisms here, what do you consider to be like the indirect negative elements of of these missions to the moon, of expanding and accelerating space in that direction?
As usual with human affairs, there are two sides to that. One is the rich becoming richer, billionaires becoming even more powerful and challenging states because of what they could do out there. Wild West #2 in outer space, so that's on the downside. The other side could be indeed that we become good stewardships of our environment, and we start to address lunar and solar system exploration in an ethical and sustainable manner. And this all boils down to how we're going to do it and carry out this exploration. Do we want to address sustainable exploration and use of space as we have dealt with the Earth's environment and climate? Probably not. We have started, as I mentioned at the beginning, to pass some environmental laws and rules. So this should guide us in using a similar approach out there. So we don't start from scratch. We've seen in the past few years, actually in the past few months, in an increased manner, discussions ripe at all levels: academic, industrial, national, international, and there are scores of organizations and groups of individuals who are laying down plans for evolving governance of outer space, and in particular today, lunar governance. So this is something that we really need. Somebody mentioned in the chat, stewardship is a more sustainable strategy than extraction. Well, I guess we need to find ways to do a bit of both. I mean, we need to find a way of enabling economic returns from the moon, if we can do that in a safe way, in a sustainable way, if we don't destroy completely that environment there, but also doing it in a way that is ethical and sustainable, preserving the moon also as a token of our heritage. We certainly let's use, and to do that we need to discuss. The International Astronomical Union when they were confronted with the increase of pollution of the night skies by satellites, streaks of satellites from the constellations, they've started to discuss with industries on ways to remediate. Is that a word? To palliate this problem. So we need to do exactly the same thing here. We need to discuss with industry, we need to discuss with decision makers, we need to discuss with the various stakeholders in order to not let precisely the Wild West happen all over again on the moon and in the solar system. I mean, this sounds a bit grandiose, but this is where I would start.
Thank you. Yes. And Alice, you know, to follow on the heels of that, what are some clear lessons that you can take from like Earth history and the history that we have in space to apply to our approach to this expansion?
Well, before I was an academic, I actually worked in mining industry on Earth, in cultural heritage management. So often I was doing that as part of large environmental impact study teams, working alongside people doing the flora, fauna, water, dust, noise, all of that kind of stuff. And I think, you know, we have a lot of systems in place on Earth that, you know, they're not perfect, but they've been effective over many, many decades. And we also have, you know, a very rigorous and sort of vibrant community of scholars around environmental impacts. And I think relating to what Jean-Claude is saying, you know, we need to start setting some of this in place. And people are thinking about this and working on this. And one of those is the Global Expert Group for Sustainable Lunar Activity, which we're both involved in. And I think sustainability is, you know, again, it's sort of a bit of a buzzword in the space world. And we could probably do with some sort of clearer definitions and ideas around it, rather than just having it as a word we use freely without, you know, necessarily meaning anything by it. But that's kind of where things are going. And I guess we're sort of drawing this back to the lessons that we've learnt on Earth. Actually, you know, one of the main ones we know from how these industries work on Earth is that people have opinions and people care about what happens to their local and regional environments, and even environments of places they don't live. And at the moment, this is something we're kind of not really factoring in. And I talk to people in you know, space industry who are surprised to think there might be opposition to lunar industry from sort of the general public. It comes as a surprise to them that there could be negative opinions. And Alvin mentioned, you know, the necessity for including stakeholders and broadening the range of stakeholders that are involved in the moon. And I think this is something we're not yet really doing much of or getting really good at. We're talking to ourselves and we know what we think as a community, but we do need to learn that lesson from Earth, which is do not ignore how passionate and how angry people can get and what the consequences of that are, which means we have to have a better story to tell about those benefits.
Yeah, thank you. You know, and I think that the I wanted to just pass this over to Alvin about the same question here. Like, what are some clear lessons from Earth history and potentially, or our history with space that we can try to apply to our approach as we accelerate out into towards the moon?
Yeah, of course. You know, I mentioned before that aspect of the old frontier and kind of the reification of the confirmation of those ideals in a lot of ways, particularly in how they damage, you know, ecologies and bodies and animals and just our environments everywhere when it comes to taking that type of approach, whether it's through your words or whether it's through your operationalization of those philosophies. And when we take those old ideas, like, I mean, they're not that old, they still exist around today, but when you take those types of philosophies that are rooted in kind of a domination of nature for all these various means, whether it's scientific or political or cultural, social, when you take that perspective and point of view and carry it on, I mean, we might not see effects of that right away, but it'll only take like 5-10 years down the road when we realize that, you know, what we've done is actually irreparably damaged our particular environments, whether that's the moon as well. But, you know, I think there's a lesson too going from the 60s when Giuseppe mentioned the Earthrise photo that really catalyzed the modern environmentalist movement. And that was also when NASA was really losing public support because you had all these protests about civil rights, about growing concerns about environmentalism, environmental justice movement was really beginning during that day too. And part of NASA pivoting more, using that photo, pivoting more towards taking an approach that, well, this is for Earth environments, was in their effort to maintain relevance politically and socially too. And I think what we're going to end up seeing if things aren't communicated or, you know, evolved in a good way is that we'll see that type of, you know, losing the political, losing the social support for the type of science that we're going to want to do for space. Because I think the concern really, for me at least, is that the science being used in like a prospecting method is that the science is going to be utilized to look for resources, look for things that exploit, increase in understanding for an industry and for, you know, governmental purposes that will enable the things that we might think are unethical or unagreeable too. So I think there's a dimension of ethical responsibility that scientists are especially empowered today to be able to communicate and lobby and, you know, have that type of communication with government actors as well. But I mean, that doesn't exclude, excuse me, the governmental actors too, are those lobbyists or whoever, from having an ethical responsibility as well to being able to change those things. But, you know, I'm a realist and a pragmatist in that. You know, I recognize that, you know, particularly in America, when it comes to industry, if there's money to be made, there'll always be people, you know, going for that. So being able to offer the type of guidelines to that, I think is a tremendous challenge. And I think we have to be able to, you know, exercise our scientific acumen in a lot of ways and, you know, our social responsibility to be able to communicate those and guide those processes respectfully. Because I would hate to see the result of all this amazing science that is being done to understand the universe lead to an exploitation that is going to eventually damage our environment, much in the same way that science was used to exploit our environments here on Earth. So we have to be very aware of that and cognizant of that, and aware that we have a communal power to be able to change that, and a communal understanding in which we can sit together, recognize these challenges, and recognize the potential futures going forward. So yeah, I see that as lessons learned, but also lessons ongoing too. So the colonization and all of that hasn't stopped, but it doesn't stop us from learning from it as we're living now too.
Yeah, thank you. So I feel like this conversation could go on, and we're going to bring this to a close though with having like each panelist here share what you think are some specific actions that we can consider for creating a roadmap for like truly sustainable lunar exploration. So, and again, like I love that Alice shared, like the word sustainability at this point almost doesn't mean anything because it's just been like greenwashed. But I think that going back to what Alvin was talking about, which is just about being in right relation, right? That's sustainability, something where it's going to continue and that all systems involved can thrive. That's to me what sustainability is. So starting with Martin, do you have a couple action points we can consider for this roadmap?
I'd like to, right now there's no governance set up for the moon. We have nothing basically. So it is a Wild West in that sense. And a lot of people in startups and industry really like that idea. I think they aren't very historically knowledgeable, but they seem to think it's a great idea. They're wrong. People talk about analogs of Antarctica or the deep seabed, and there's nothing there, and for the moon when they talk about the moon. But I prefer what my colleague Alana Krolikovsky says, and we should think of it as the Amazon. It's clear that the Amazon contains a lot of good stuff, but also it's clear we don't know most of that stuff, and so we have yet to find it. And it's also clear that logging is not the best use of that in that whole regime environment, and we should take that to heart, I think. And I also point out that how we behave when we go to the moon is going to set the tone for any solar system expansion of humanity for years to come, perhaps many decades even. And so we should try to set off on a good path, and I think astronomers are trying to do that with this by defining places on the moon which should at least be preserved at some level, but not the whole moon. That would be useless because no one would believe us or pay any attention. But as we try to protect certain special places on the moon, that would at least set an example of giving value to non-commercial, non-geopolitical interests on the moon.
Wonderful. Alice, same question.
Well, I think there's a couple of things we can do right now. And one of these is exactly what Martin just said as well. And with the Global Expert Group for Sustainable Lunar Activity, we're working on ideas around an international committee for lunar coordination that would be able to play some role in the governance aspect of all of these activities. But I also want to pick up on something we were discussing a bit earlier as well. So in the terms of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the moon belongs to all humanity. And if that is truly the case, then all humanity are stakeholders and deserve to have a say in what's going to happen. And I think it would be a really important step for each nation or agency, let's say, to do a systematic poll of their citizens or their residents' opinions about what they want to happen with the moon and what they think of what's going on now. So we could actually get a global survey of how people feel about the moon and about contemporary activities there. If it was done on a nation by nation basis, it would not be impossible to do. And there are many people far more expert than me in that whole science of gathering public opinion, but we could do it right now. So we're not caught by surprise when, further down the track when things happen.
Yeah, that's an incredible suggestion. And it just brings to mind how technology available now versus even 5 years ago, it allows for something like that. We have this capacity to now actually really bring in that amount of data of that many opinions and perspectives. Jean-Claude, some
yes.
action items. Yeah.
A couple of points on Alice mentioning the fact that the moon is for all humankind, and therefore all humankind should have a say. I fully subscribe to that. This is actually the reason why updating lunar governance should be under the hands of the UN and not under national law or specific agreements, interagency agreements like the Artemis Accords, which can lay down principles, that's fine. But this is the only forum, the UN, where all countries and potentially all humankind have the possibility to have a vote on the matter. So this is an important aspect. On the reserved areas that Martin mentioned, yes, there's another aspect other than astronomy where this is put to use is what we call planetary protection, meaning rules to prevent biological contamination of celestial bodies. COSPAR is in charge of edicting guidelines, and we also are converging towards having specific sites to be preserved for future scientific use. One thing that I would like to just conclude on this matter, we all talked about updating and having a clear lunar governance framework. For obvious reasons, it's not necessarily accepted by all actors, all groups equally as a main priority. We all understand why. Martin mentioned it. However, what I have observed in talking to industry people is that international norms of behavior for lunar landings and operations is amongst their top priorities. And this is an area where scientists and industry can converge, because if only for liability issues, you do something wrong, you hurt someone or you hurt someone's assets, you need operational guidelines and norms of behavior. So we should start there. This is a concrete area where we can get industry and science together working on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Alvin.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that has been said too. I think developing the community to be able to establish the community values, I think is really important. And in particular, I guess my simple ask or ideation would be the inclusion of Indigenous people in these conversations. And I heard the Amazon mentioned, and there are 385 Indigenous communities that take care of the Amazon. And when you look at Indigenous people globally too, I think it's up to acknowledge like 80% of the biodiversity of the world is caretaken by Indigenous people as well. So having Indigenous people be the stakeholders and be respected as really primary stakeholders in the involvement of defining activities in space as people that are, receiving the effects of activities like rocket launches and experimentation and all of that that's happening in their land on Earth, affecting their biodiversity, their environments, and having them as stakeholders that carry their own knowledge, their subject matter expertise, their lived experience, just as influential and acknowledged as a CEO or as an agency head or anything like that. Because I think people are coming to recognize like the influence and the knowledge that Indigenous people have in relating to their ecologies on Earth, like in a good way and not just a sustainable way, but in a regenerative way as well. As regenerating those type of ecologies here on Earth is becoming recognized. And we have to acknowledge that expertise when it comes to wanting to do not just sustainable exploitation of space ecologies, but sustainable relationships that our people, generations, 7 generations down the road, can have that type of positive affirmation and respect and understanding. So we really are shaping those ethics, those cultural norms that will be, of course, changed because the world changes as well, but that will hold through going all the way to the many generations. So I just leave that as kind of a inkling of a thought that all those, committees and everything else like that, there are Indigenous people out there that do have an expertise and that are able to communicate and be able to work, with the system, but also challenge it in constructive ways too, to help enrich those conversations to ensure that we're including all these voices that do have this type of knowledge that we're seeking too. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Now we are going to open it up to questions. So if you want to ask a question by coming on video, audio, go ahead and raise your hand. And I will call on you. We'll have time for 1, maybe 2 questions. Dylan, I know a lot of chat questions have been coming in the chat. Do you have a question to read to our panel here?
Yes. Okay. So the first one comes from Neil, and he's from Titan Space Industries, and he says he appreciates the opportunity to attend this conference and is wondering what your proposed regulatory outline framework is for lunar environmental protection and who should be in charge.
So anybody feel particularly called? That's a pretty specific ask there, and I don't know if anybody's gonna be able to give their 20-page bullet point. But I think that last point there that's really interesting is who should be in charge of making the regulatory framework. Jean-Claude.
I mentioned quickly, I think the only organization worldwide that could tackle the matter was the UN for the reasons I mentioned. The main updating the governance is a feat in itself. Nobody wants to touch the Outer Space Treaty, which is remarkably, well, I won't say it. I was about to say useless. That's not true. It is absolutely useful, but it has a number of shortcomings. And it should be updated. That's already difficult, but I fear that an even greater difficulty will be not just to legislate, if that's a word, but to find ways to make rules obeyed by the various explorers of the solar system. How to impose the rules is really what will be difficult in the future.
Mhm.
Right.
Martin. Mhm.
Yeah, right now there are the two paths that are moving forwards, right? There is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space of the United Nations, and that's the great thing there is it has everybody in it, all the spacefaring nations and many others. The bad thing about it is it takes a long time to do anything. They have a 5-year study ongoing into resources of the moon, by which they mean only the physical resources. The other is faster moving, but less universal. And that's the US-led Artemis Accords, which has 30-something signatures now, 36, 38. It keeps going up. That's great. And they're going to start talking about these details of what rules should we try to follow in many different areas, but this would include use of resources and setting aside safety zones for science as well as for operations. They could establish a bunch of norms of behavior early on. The problem is that it does not include everybody. It particularly doesn't include China, and it's not going to include China, it looks like. So if the Artemis Accords are seen too much as a US-led and US-imposed set of standards, that could lead to a reaction against them. So it's a big problem how we go forward. I hope they can go sort of in parallel, reinforcing each other.
Mhm. Alice.
Just wanted to mention a few key documents because we have some or many of the people involved in them here. One is the Vancouver recommendations on space mining, which came out of the Outer Space Institute that Aaron Boley, and who's in the next panel, is on in 2021, which has some principles about space environmental management. Then there are the Hague building blocks from 2019. The UN has recently finalised its long-term sustainability guidelines, and the Global Expert Group for Sustainable Lunar Activities also released its key elements and recommended framework, and I've dropped the link to that in the chat. So we have quite a number of really good kind of high-level principle documents reinforcing the importance of good environmental management, but we definitely need some organization to take the lead and all of those dots joined up and filled in.
Great. Okay, we've got just a few, like less than a minute left. And because of that, I think I would like to just have Alvin jump on to that same question, which is kind of the who should be in charge of this regulatory framework.
I mean, it's kind of argued, or it's hard to argue with what has been said, excuse me. Yeah, I think in thinking, I guess, contextually about where I'm at, so in the United States, I think there is different political levers, I guess you can say, to be able to pull on that would allow this type of conversation to happen more in the way that we're hoping to happen here. I mean, I think there's a lot more people than we would think that are on the side of wanting to have these conversations about the ethics and sustainability when it comes to space actions coming from the US, whether it be commercial or whether it be governmental. So, I'm looking forward to that type of conversation and that type of facilitation, but the increasing challenges to what is going on there will be exciting to see what happens and how that changes, particularly on the political side, with different aspects too. I mean, in the US, there's different laws that require, federal agencies to look at environmental justice concerns. And I'm sure you'll hear this from Justin in the next panel, but the laws requiring consultation with Native American communities as well as other communities. So being able to demonstrate and encapsulate that consultation process on the US side, I mean, I'm hoping that can demonstrate to the rest of the world too, that even a country like the United States with this complicated history can at least begin to engage in these types of proper conversations and ethical conversations as well. So that's where I'm hoping to go from. Hoping to see that happen here in the US. But I agree with everything else that my fellow panelists have said too about having an international conversation. The relationship about that as well will be really important moving forward.
Thank you. Right. I think that if anything, this outlines, it can be difficult to get a small room full of people to agree on anything and how to proceed. And so when we think about the entire planet and the myriad of diversity of opinions and values and histories and experiences, and trying to come up with something that's unified, it's not as simple, but it's worth doing. It's worth the effort. And I want to really thank my panelists here today, Jean-Claude, Alice, Martin, Alvin. Thank you very much. This has been very enlightening. And we're going to have some breakouts now so that everyone in the audience will have an opportunity to potentially discuss these topics. And I'm hoping that the panelists, some of them will be able to stay and jump into some of the rooms.